Good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you all. Sorry, I've got a... I've got an echo coming through.
Hello everybody, my name's Naomi from Festival of Ideas. It's lovely to welcome you this afternoon. We're just working to get Jane with us back on screen, so she's going to be with us in a minute. And in fact, here she is, wonderful. Oh, disappeared again. If I could perhaps just ask the panelists to introduce themselves. Adrian, can I start with you?
Thank you very much. My name is Adrian Pabst. I'm a Professor of Politics and Deputy Director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research.
Lovely, thank you. Aida, can I continue just with a quick introduction?
Yes, thank you. I'm Aida, a research associate in the University of Bath, the IPR.
Lovely, thank you very much. Jamie, can I continue?
Sure, I'm Jamie Cooke. I'm head of RSA Scotland, part of the global RSA think tank.
Lovely, thank you. And finally, Mike.
Hello, yes, I'm Mike Brewer. I'm Chief Economist at the Resolution Foundation, a think tank devoted to improving the lives of those on low to middle incomes.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And now I will hand you over to our chair, Jane Millar.
Am I now okay? Yes, thank you very much. Apologies for that, everyone. I don't know quite what happened. I could hear a terrible echo. So it was going to be, and it still is my pleasure to welcome you to this session this afternoon on universal basic income, work and welfare. You've already met our four wonderful panelists. We've got a very important topic to be looking at, because in this session we're going to be exploring some of the key challenges for employment and welfare policy. How might a universal basic income fit into a future where the world of work looks very fragmented, with more diverse ways of working, with higher unemployment, with lower wages, with more instability and change for individuals? The pandemic is, of course, the immediate context, and we've seen already some of the different effects on different groups of workers, differences by gender, by age, by ethnicity, by sector of employment, by region, and so on. These inequalities may well continue because they're not created by the current crisis, but are heightened and made more visible. So that context is very important to us. On the welfare side, the social security side, in the UK, we have an increasingly blurred the lines between support in and out of work. We used to have a social security system under the Beveridge system, which was very much about wage replacement. Increasingly, our system is also about wage supplement. And with universal credit, the very major change that's being introduced at the moment has to do both those jobs. It has to be the complete income for some people and a wage top up for other people. And we've seen some of the challenges in doing that over the past 10 years as this has been implemented. Maybe it's different from universal basic income, but maybe this has some lessons for how we think about universal basic income. The previous panel picked up on some of these issues, but now we've got a chance to look at them in a bit more depth. We've got 4 excellent speakers. They've introduced themselves, so I shall just give them their 10 minutes each. Please put your questions in and join in the chat, and we'll pick those up at the end. And I'm going to start with Aida. Would you like to kick us off with your 10 minutes, please? Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Jane, for having me here. It's a pleasure to share the table with all of you. So I like to take 2 of the questions in the description of the session. One is about the reshape of the UK labour market, and the other is related with the technological change. So to the question, will COVID fundamentally reshape the UK labour market? The answer is simple and is yes. Perhaps the second and more interesting question that we should ask us is how this transformation is going to be. And to answer that, probably we need to think on the mechanisms and the factors that are playing a role in the COVID crisis. And in this case, I want to refer to the socially distancing measures, which have a direct effect in some sectors that we all know: accommodation and food and services, retail trade, art, entertainment and recreation, construction, transportation, etc. And the reason is because these sectors demand close human interaction. And that is for the UK, but also for other countries. Another common factor within those sectors is the inability of workers to perform their job under the restrictions. So, for example, we can find if someone has difficulties to perform the job under the restriction, the risk of losing the job is high, or being furloughed or laid off. But the damage is not just for workers. At the moment, it's also for firms, and in some cases for the whole sector. That seems obvious, but it's not, because it implies the transformation of some industries that now and after the pandemic. At this point, this is a survival issue. For example, in the entertainment and the recreation industry, they face a huge challenge because cinemas, theaters are closed, or when they are open, they only allow a limited amount of customers. So at this point, they need to think in new ways to reach their audience, supply their services, and this is an important change in the sector. I'm not suggesting that these sectors will disappear. That is probably too much to say. We don't know it yet. But what I certainly could say is that all these sectors that are the most affected need to adapt to the new reality. Coming back to workers again, unfortunately, this crisis has shown us that there is a strong correlation between the probability of being under high risk of losing the job and being employed in a low-paid occupation. Being a young worker, being a woman, or are under zero contract hours or part-time. For all those group of people, we need to provide some financial support. And this is what brings us today to explore whether the current benefits and the support packages are adequate. But before that, let me to add another factor, which I believe plays also an important role in the crisis. I refer to the accelerated digital transformation we all have experienced in this pandemic. As an example, the possibility of running a virtual workshop today. The imposition of this socially distancing measure, which I don't disagree with them because they are needed, but all this have changed the way that we interact with people, the channels of communication, how we perform our jobs. For instance, how many people used Zoom or Teams before the pandemic? Probably not many, but today, this is one of our daily tools in the workplace. Similarly, in the manufacturing sector, we observe that the use of capital, new technologies, AI, new software, robotics, all of those are an advantage for firms who previously invested in that. At this point, using capital is safer, and it increases productivity, as we know from the economic theory. And in some cases, for firms, it's a matter of survival as well. But this technology and the new tools are not available for everyone because of technical issues, financial conditions, etc. So that is a selection bias process. And what I think is that many firms might not survive. First, the current health crisis with the socially distancing measures, and second, and the consequent digital transformation. Another element to add in the technological change is the e-commerce. This is another example how people is switching their patterns of consumption. More and more people are buying online, is safer, is secure, people is happy with that, and we see in the statistics that e-commerce is growing fast. But that comes also in detriment of some retail jobs. Of course, the e-commerce is going to create new occupations too, but we are waiting to see the final balance. And this is something that we need to think about too. Finally, the ability of working from home, even in high-income countries, is still low. 27%, according to some calculations from the IMF or other non-economies. 34 for the US, 31 for the UK. Then there is a large percentage of the labor population force that is under a huge risk. But it happens that we are a society, and we can only be kind everyone who faces vulnerabilities, because it's not fair and it's not even desirable for the recovery of the economy. Having millions of people in the universal credit system is also not very healthy in macro and inequality sense. So what the government can do? I would say that there should be a focalized assistance in the more affected people and their families. The government should provide protection and extend the social insurance, safety net to cushion all the income and employment losses. And as an example, the job retention scheme is a good candidate. I believe if we compare all the settings of the scheme along the months, I would stay with the one in March, because it's more generous, it's more adequate, it promotes that employers actually keep workers in the scheme. And overall, this is for the pandemic, but for the future, it is also needed to implement a instead of retraining and reskilling programs, because the world change. This rapid transformation is going to set a different demand of skills and occupations. People need to be prepared for that. That's all.
Great, thank you very much, Aida. Perfect timing and raising a number of very interesting broad points. I like the way you brought the consumption into it as well as the world of work. I think it's very important for us to think about that relationship. Let's move on then to our next speaker, Mike Brewer. Mike from the Resolution Foundation, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jane, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. So speaking as an economist who studied living standards and poverty and inequality for several years, and now I work at an organisation which I said strives to improve living standards for low to middle income households in the UK, I should confess at the start that I haven't really seen UBI as being the most important goal that I or my organisation is striving for. I don't think it's the biggest thing, the best thing we could do for low to middle income households in the UK. I had historically seen the advantages of UBI in those countries which have poorly developed safety nets, so dysfunctional social security systems or welfare systems with enormous gaps, big gaps in entitlement, people falling through the cracks. And whatever you might say think about the UK's benefit system, I wouldn't classify the UK as being in that case. And so my approach had always been, when people had made the case for UBI or shown particular groups who could be much better off under a UBI, I'm thinking about the UK, I would always respond, well, couldn't we just change aspects of the social security system that you already have in order to benefit such groups? But I think it's fair to say, of course, the crisis has changed many things. It's beginning to change my thinking on that. As we came into the crisis, one of the things that we were documenting is the really large number of additional claims of universal credit. And we had a couple of weeks where we just weren't quite sure whether the system was going to stand up to the volume of claims hitting it, and by and large it did actually, which is tribute to its digital service. Systems in other countries fared less well. It was one point people made then was that if we had gone into the crisis with a UBI, then we would have had the mechanism in place to get out payments to those who needed it, as quickly as could be, without the complexity of having to claim online and the delay that some people experienced. But then as the crisis has gone on, I think what we've also seen is now that there's no longer the demand for, well, we've seen that immediate crisis has gone away, the immediate surge of applicants for welfare support. And what we're seeing now as we go on into our 6th and 7th month, I think is more the debate around generosity and whether our current welfare system provides enough. And the discussions we have had about the continuation of the job retention scheme, or what should follow a job retention scheme. We've got the new job support scheme that's coming in next month, and that's already, and including the extra scheme the Chancellor added last week for those people in businesses which will be told to shut down. Now, sorry, I'm making a long point here. That new scheme has a replacement rate of 66%, so people will get 60% of their previous earnings back. People have said, of course, that's far too inadequate, but it is, of course, much more generous than is provided by universal credit. And where I see that debate going is really suggesting that we need to have a sort of proper debate, perhaps not about, well, as well as about UBI, but also about whether our welfare system should provide benefits which are related to your previous earnings. So I think we will also see, the nature of this crisis, the length of time that people have had to be unemployed if they've lost their job, is making us think again about levels of adequacy, levels of generosity, in the welfare system, as well as how many people could be entitled. So again, I guess another point, perhaps saying that UBI might not be the magic solution. But one area where the crisis, I think, has also illustrated the need for something like UBI is in the way it's exposed the often arbitrary boundaries between employment and self-employment. I mean, Jane, in your introduction, was talking about universal credit in the UK, which was explicitly designed to bridge that gap between being out of work and being in work. And because of that, it actually does one of the things that proponents for a UBI call for. It's a benefit, a payment which stays with you as your employment status changes. But what the crisis has shown is that gap between employment and self-employment is one that can be very hard for governments or welfare systems to think their way around. Basically, coming into the crisis, if you were self-employed, and we didn't really get much out of the British social security system. You weren't entitled to unemployment benefit, you couldn't get sick pay, and so on. But as soon as the crisis hit, we realized, of course, that was completely inadequate. We needed to have a way of providing self-employed people with some money if they were to self-isolate. And we had to do something about the hundreds of thousands of self-employed people who've lost their businesses during this pandemic. And that's why we've seen the self-employment grant and so on. But if you think about how the policy works, and look how the policy has changed over the last few months, you can see the government really tying itself in knots as it tries to work out, well, how on earth do we design a system for supporting non-working self-employed people that tries to balance the need to be provide support for those who need it most, but also the need to be fair to the taxpayer and not pay out large sums of money to self-employed people, workers who don't need it. So the welfare system does struggle with that at the moment. And as Jane was saying in introduction, that could be one area where in the future we're going to see sort of more blurring of the boundaries between, maybe not between not working and working, but between employment and self-employment. And I think that's one area where some sort of system which can be blind to those distinctions may well come to play a role. Thank you, Jane. Oh. And Jane still mutes.
For us to follow up on, particularly in relation to those boundaries. I think those issues of the boundaries and what UBI can do to stretch across them is very interesting. But let's move on to Jamie for your 10 minutes. Would you like to start now?
Thanks, and some really fascinating points made already. And I think, particularly with Mike's contribution there, a real reflection, I think, that there's a beginning, and what the pandemic has done is really raised those fundamental questioning around the system as a whole. So not just the mechanics and the delivery, but actually, what do we want social security support and work itself to mean and look like moving forward? For as someone who's been very involved in the basic income discussions here in Scotland and elsewhere, I think some of the issues that we saw and confronted and have talked about in terms of precarious work and so on have really been highlighted during this crisis. We've seen the impact that it's starting to have, and we're going to see an ever greater impacts moving forward. And I think that's what's really shifted the debate. So to use the Scottish example, we came into the pandemic in a situation where there was some broad interest from Scottish Government, from across the political spectrum and civic society, in the idea of basic income as an experiment, something to test. The feasibility group recently published a report into what a large-scale experiment in Scotland could look like. The pandemic has shifted that discussion dramatically to the point where you have the First Minister talking about wishing to introduce basic income as a policy for Scotland, albeit she doesn't have the powers to do so, but also that far wider debate stretching across the UK now. There was a Westminster Hall debate this morning led by Ronnie Cowan MP from Inverclyde. There's been a lot of discussion during the recent Lib Dem leadership election with Ed Davey, the new leader, very supportive of basic income, and the growth of the UBI lab movement in particular across the north of England, Wales and elsewhere that has really driven that. And I think it's because there is this questioning of whether we need to reset the system. Is it enough for that incremental change? Or actually, do we fundamentally need to look at what we offer, why we offer, and what it's rooted in, particularly given universal credits drift into that focus on austerity, sanctions, and punishment. I find it really interesting, given the topic of this panel, that the debate in Scotland certainly has traditionally been very focused for basic income around the idea of social justice, around fairness, around giving people access to opportunities within society, and not about automation and the changing nature of work. That's probably something that we've seen more in a US context in terms of the discussions there. But I remember talking to a colleague in Wales, Mark Hooper, who pointed out that actually automation is an issue of social justice. Many of the communities who are most likely to be hit by the changes in jobs moving forward are the very same communities who have already been through one or more periods of deindustrialisation, of job loss and of impact, and that will find this much harder to adapt to. And I think that the current crisis is actually going to speed up some of those trends that were coming anyway in terms of change, but actually are starting to have an impact. And my colleagues at the RSA, Fabian Wallace-Stevens and Emma Morganti, published a new report today called Who's at Risk, looking at industries in the UK in light of COVID and the risk that they face, both in terms of the current pandemic, but also in terms of longer term automation. And I think it shows that there is an upheaval coming across society and across the world of work that we need to be ahead of the curve, from my perspective, to start to address. So yes, we can see some of the industries like hospitality that obviously are suffering to a large scale during the current crisis, but also can see the challenges that automation could bring to them moving forward. But actually also some of the industries that the crisis has brought opportunities to. So looking at retail workers, for example, and key workers, where actually the automation is continuing alongside this and is being sped up by this crisis. When I go to my local supermarket, I'm encouraged now to do the scanning myself because it reduces interaction with other humans. I'm asked to put everything through the till myself because it makes sense in the crisis we're in. It'll be very hard to step back from that again as we move forward. And I think we really have to be starting to address that and look at how we can bring this security. And to me, that's what a basic income starts to offer. It's not a panacea. I think that's been covered already throughout today's various talks, and I think already mentioned here, but it's an important one to point back. For me, it's about a foundation. It's about resetting that social contract. It's about looking about how we give people the strength and the opportunities to move forward. And I think that's where it's starting to pick up that interest and that opportunity. It's a chance for us to start to challenge the very concept of work. I think the way we talk about work, much as the way we talk about social security, is rooted in the post-war consensus, the mention of Beveridge already. You know, Beveridge's report was to respond to those giants, those evils that we faced. They're still there, but they've evolved, they've changed, they've adapted, they look slightly different in the world we're in and the world we're moving into. Our systems and our structures and our presumptions, I don't feel, have moved with them. So I actually think that as we are in this period of the COVID crisis, which will not be the last pandemic we see, will not be the last crisis we see, we have a chance both to respond to the immediacy of the problem we face, but also to start to prepare for better responses in future. And I think that basic income offers us one part of that solution and one part of that opportunity. So if we could build a post-war consensus that started to change and challenge the presumptions that were made at that point, I think we also have a chance for a post-pandemic consensus that allows us to start to question the type of society that we want to be, and actually how we start to value work in its widest sense. So not just paid employment, the self-employment I think Mike touched on very importantly, but also the other responsibilities and contributions that people make through caring responsibilities, through creative responsibilities, volunteering and so on. I think it's a chance to develop that opportunity to give people some of that space and autonomy to make decisions while still recognising that they're part of something bigger through society. So I think this is a really exciting time for that challenge. I think it's something that we need to pull apart as much as possible. And I think it's really interesting to see how it's been looked at in very different ways across the world, but very much with a growing level of support and interest across the political spectrum. And I think the questions today hopefully allow us to continue that pulling apart as we move forward.
Jamie, that's great. Thank you so very much. Very interesting points. And I think your challenge to us about, do we need to reset the system? Is this what needs to happen? And also your hints at the North-South divide, perhaps, on some of these issues might raise some interesting discussion as we go on. But let's move on to our final panelist today. Adrian, over to you.
Thank you, Jane, very much indeed. And can also say thank you to the audience. It's a wonderful turnout. And also thank you to my fellow panelists. It's been absolutely fascinating. I'll start by saying that whilst I've always had reservations about UBI, I am very attracted by two of its, I think, core ideas. One is universality, the idea that there is something universal, which I think is sort of intrinsically good and right and important. And the other thing is the idea of cutting out means testing, which when it comes to welfare is not only extraordinarily expensive, but also can be very humiliating. And I think those two aspects, universality and a less, and indeed perhaps not humiliating system at all, is really important. However, I still, in the end, come down on the other side because I think there's something about the dignity of labor that's worth defending. And there's something about rewards for contribution Though it's important to say that contribution isn't just paid employment, as Jamie has just remarked. There's obviously lots of unpaid work that is hugely significant. But I think I just want to start by saying that, you know, we're not living through an era of change so much as a change of era. And I think it's both the post-war model that is fast disappearing, but also I think core aspects of the post-79 model. So both the sort of post-war Keynesian model and also the Thatcherite model are both in crisis for different reasons. And what may emerge could either be a lot more precarious, a lot more unequal, or it could be a lot more about reciprocity and real solidarity with everyone who's making a contribution to society. I think what we're finding with COVID is that it's a sort of short-term economic disruption, which leads to recession and a rise in unemployment and higher welfare benefit claims, has already been mentioned. And so at NISA, we've done a lot of work on the economic and social scarring of that. But I think it's the more fundamental shifts that we're seeing that are of interest to us here this afternoon. You know, the more fundamental shifts when it comes to the sectors that may or may not recover, and what that means for the labor market going forward, and indeed for welfare. But also, I think fundamentally, what's happening, you know, what's happening to labor, what's happening to work. The idea that perhaps, you know, graduate jobs in the knowledge economy may not be growing in the way that we thought even 5 or 10 years ago, and that other types of occupations, the key workers, the more manual, the more vocational work, has actually acquired a renewed standing. And the sacrifice and service of all the key workers is, I think, what allowed us to stay home, saves lives, and protect the NHS at the height of the pandemic. And I think that's an enduring shift. And that then links to automation, to which I'll come back. Now, on the face of it, it looks as if the pandemic makes the case for UBI stronger. It's already been mentioned by my fellow panelists. I mean, the coronavirus job retention scheme could almost be like a prelude. You know, it was the biggest labour market intervention since 45, and perhaps, you know, since the onset of modern Britain. So quite a remarkable intervention. And at NISA, we found that without those wage subsidies, covering nearly 10 million jobs, the UK would have faced a loss of employment approaching 20%, maybe more. And of course, importantly, an erosion of skills and social capital. So maybe UBI is the next logical step to avoid mass unemployment. And then there's the whole effect on digitization and indeed automation. In addition to which, we could mention things like working from home. You know, homes are turning into offices, and offices will be turning into homes, perhaps. And that's an enormous shift to the world of work that we need to take into account. So perhaps UBI could help reduce precarity and reliance on what the late David Graeber, and I apologize for the word, but it's after all his, you know, what he called bullshit jobs, right? These really demeaning, low-paid, low-productivity jobs that have sort of kept the economic system going for some time. In turn, if UBI did that, it could create conditions for high levels of health and well-being, which is very different from perhaps the current capitalist deaths of despair, which the work of Anne Case and Angus Deaton, I think, have documented at great length. And then there's the whole point about universal credit, that seems to be a much more much easier system, and so perhaps it's both economically more efficient and socially superior, and that would make the case for an even more universal one like UBI. But I still have reservations, both practical and principle, and I'll just mention them briefly. The practical ones are really about the feasibility and the costs. I mean, some of those sums involved are colossal, and I think as economists and indeed others, we have to ask the question of trade-offs. You know, if we are going to spend billions and billions on UBI, what are we not spending it on? And that needs to be part of the conversation. And I think it links in with perhaps alternatives like basic infrastructure. You want to create a universal basic infrastructure that everyone benefits from, and you can't necessarily finance both. There's also a question of, in a world of automation, if indeed that is the world that will unfold, how are you going to capture all the profits from artificial intelligence, robots, and machine working? You know, is it easy to tax global tech platforms? And I think we're finding that it's not. So where would that revenue even come from? It's not so clear. The other, I think, issue is for the labor market. You know, automation may or may not be the dominant trend. In some professions, no doubt, in others, not at all. And I think the resurgence of key workers shows that manual vocational work is an enduring aspect. Education and caring, I don't think, can ever be done in the same way by robots or machines. And we're seeing this now with the pandemic. I don't think that's a temporary change. Think of social care. It's one of the fastest growing sectors in terms of employment and needs to be supported. And I don't think there's any substitute for it. And I don't think UBI is the way to do it, because it could also put pressure on wages, basically saying, well, we can keep on paying carers and nurses and so on, low wages because they're getting UBI. So I don't think it's a good way to reward that really important work. But then there's the principled objections, and I'll be brief. The first, I think, is simply that it risks devaluing not only work, but also more fundamentally the dignity of labor. And of course, by labor, again, I mean not just paid employment, but all sorts of unpaid work that is being done, especially caring work, which I think we need to recognize much more as a society. Work, as we know, is a source of both income and meaning. And if it's not a source of income, it's certainly a source of meaning. It not only helps us to pay the bills when it's paid, but it also helps to be recognized for our talents and for our effort and vocation. Linked to that is the second principal objection, which is UBI risks undermining the principle of contribution. And contribution is really important, I think, for reasons of economic and social justice, because arguably it is also what makes us social, political beings and human beings, because we are human, or only more fully human, perhaps, when we also earn the esteem of our fellow citizens for the contributions we make to society. And one contribution is certainly the contribution of work and the care we have for others. And it's by no means the only one, but I think it needs to be recognized and rewarded. And then there's the third principled rejection about universality. It's an attractive feature of UBI, but I think it may also risk reducing universality to a simplistic and standardized payment, right? One that supposedly covers all of our social, or certainly our economic needs. And what are the problems here? Well, there's free riding. There is the risk of discouraging duties, and there's also the risk of actually diminishing citizenship, because we are now essentially defined by being passive recipients rather than more active agents. And agency is important for people's esteem and for contribution and for human creativity. And citizenship also involves relations that are anchored in both rights and obligations towards others. UBI, I think, may inadvertently undermine the mutual obligations. Finally, and I'll conclude on this, UBI assumes, or certainly versions of UBI assume, that there are no alternatives to achieving universal support. But I think there are, whether it's a universal jobs guarantee linked to training and through life learning, universal basic infrastructure, as I've mentioned, and others. And in terms of welfare, there are other ways of helping people, more decentralized, more mutualized welfare that doesn't depend either on state top-down, one-size-fits-all solutions or purely market-driven ones. So before we assume that universality can only be delivered by UBI, I think we should be looking at other alternatives as well. Finally, yes, COVID suggests that UBI can be a short-term measure, perhaps to correct a contraction in employment, saving jobs, saving skills, saving social capital. But I don't think it's a medium or long-term panacea. I don't think there is going to be a world without work or workers. I think the task for us going forward after COVID, or while we're still in the midst of it, is actually to rebuild work, to secure the dignity of labor, to make sure all forms of work, knowledge work, but also manual and vocational work, is properly rewarded. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Thank you for that very interesting contribution, broadening out and thinking about a range of social justice and reciprocity issues. We've got it's great to watch the chat, I must say, and to see people's comments coming in, the questions coming in. We've got a bit of time for a few questions. And I want to start with the caring question, actually, because most of you, I think, have said something about this unpaid work of care and what universal basic income might mean for this. And we had a question specifically on that. Will universal basic income encourage women's unpaid care work to the detriment of their access to employment? What will it mean for care work? Maybe I can start with you, Jamie, because you did pick up on that.
Thanks, no, and an excellent question. And I think shows again that basic income is not a panacea. It doesn't solve everything. It needs other policies alongside it to work. So there's a big debate from a feminist perspective of whether basic income could be an emancipatory policy for women. It's paid directly and individually. There's no dependency on a head of household. Or yes, could it also be something that's used to reinforce traditional gender roles? I think it's about combining it with the wider infrastructure and societal space that we have alongside this. A lot of these roles, though, are already happening, and they are not being supported. They are not being recognised. And I think we've all touched on that in different ways, whether we come to the same conclusion about how to respond to it. I was always struck a couple of years ago when a UK government minister was asked about paying more money to carers, and was asked, why would we pay for something we get for free? And I think that was a very telling reflection of how little it is valued on a political level. So I think it's about using that as a foundation, as a secure base that, and it is, women that are largely providing the caring roles and responsibilities, but there is part of the wider debate around what we want to look with it. And actually, I thought Adrian made some fantastic points, but for me, one of the fundamental aspects of basic income is about giving people agency. It's about taking away conditionality and allowing them to make choices for themselves. And I think that the basic income in that context, provided by that wider social context, could be a very important part of giving that increased space. I think that was really interesting. I had a conversation recently with a group of young people in Scotland who have been involved in the care system, who were talking about what basic income might mean for them. And there was a very healthy scepticism about how a basic income as an idea could be used actually to undermine their own abilities and choices. And I think whether you're an advocate like me or a skeptic like others, I think it's important we do challenge it, because the system could be delivered in many different ways, some positive, some not so.
Adrian, did you want to come in on this one about caring and how UBI might relate to it?
Yes, and I think some of what Jamie said is absolutely right. Yes, I can see how a universal basic income paid to people who've been doing all sorts of unpaid and unrecognized caring work would be a very attractive solution to an endemic problem that I agree has not been solved, and there aren't any easy solutions other than UBI. I suppose what I would say is that caring, I think, because it is also going to continue being a paid occupation as well as an unpaid one, I think generally needs to have its status raised, radically. So let's also say, yes, there are, carers who may benefit from UBI, but there are lots of carers who are currently in very badly paid jobs with very little training of any, with no social or very little social recognition. And I think it's also that issue. So I'm happy to look at UBI as a targeted, tailored, measure, but I'm not sure that it would necessarily cover those in work. So then the question is, why would we call it a UBI, right? We may be saying it's very targeted support for some, but I think the general status of caring needs to be raised. I think there should be something like a Royal College of Carers, right? Where you really get the recognition you get for other professions, as well as lots of vocational training opportunities, up and down the country. So I can see the case, but I'm not sure that necessarily that means it's a case for UBI across the board. I think we still need to be tackling issues to do with work and employment as they are. But yeah, I think there is a strong case for those, especially in a more domestic setting. And often, as you say, Jamie, there are women who've been completely neglected by the system for, centuries, millennia. So yes, there's an attraction. I recognize it.
Thank you. We seem to have lost Mike. Seems to have disappeared. I don't know whether he'll be coming back in. But let's move on to think about employment issues, because a number of questions have come up thinking about the impact on employers and what all this might mean for employers. So, for example, will employers reduce pay? How might basic income relate to a job guarantee scheme? How might they be associated? What sort of jobs might be at risk if basic income comes in? So thinking about it from the employer's side. Aida, do you want to start us off on this? Some thoughts on this side of things?
Yes, thank you. Perhaps thinking in the basic income, I believe is a good measure, at least in the short term. Thinking in the side of employers, because at the moment what we observe with the changes on the rules of the job retention scheme is that it becomes harder for employers to keep jobs because they prefer to count the number of employers rather than number of hours. At least in the last design of the job retention scheme. That's why I said previously that for me, one of the best policies is to keep implemented the scheme with the rules stated in March. There is a very nice study from the Resolution Foundation that they show what is the impact on the income for the different schemes, and we can clearly see that it's more beneficial the first job retention scheme. So in that sense, I would advocate for that that policy. And I'd like to comment something in terms of the caring and the unpaid work. I believe that at least in the short term, it's also very desirable to have a sort of basic income or unconditional payment, because either way, this is a gender issue too. And these women who are in this unpaid work, they are not going to offer labor anyway, because they are it's a need in a way. So yeah, that's my comment.
Thank you. Jamie, effect on wages?
Yeah, again, some really interesting points. I think there would definitely be a push in different ways. I think the suggestion has been that certain lower paid jobs would start to be able to push. If people had more choice and flexibility to actually move out of work and try other alternatives, then there's maybe a push for wages to go up there, but actually maybe in some more attractive jobs, the wages would go down if there was a higher range of people able to access them. I think for me, the critical part here again, and I sound a bit like a broken record, but it is the interaction with other policies. So for me, a basic income has to retain a living wage, because otherwise you would just see it disappear into to employers and by subsidising wages. It requires looking at rent control and rent control situations there, because otherwise you would see it disappear into pockets of landlords, which I think has been brought up in some of the questions and chat so far. So it's about giving that space. I think, you know, we heard mention David Graeber earlier. I think it's a critical pushback against some of those jobs that perhaps are not as full of meaning. You know, Adrian talked about the dignity of labour, and I think probably we'd all really like to see that. I'm sure, unfortunately, many of the jobs that exist currently don't bring that dignity in any shape or form, and I think we do need to start to challenge what those opportunities are, but they need these complementary policies to help ensure that basic income doesn't just vanish into other pockets.
And thank you. Adrian, do you want to say something particularly? Are you in favour of job guarantee?
Well, absolutely. I think that is another way of recognizing, you know, a specific need. You know, if those people in society who'd like to work can't have a job, I mean, that's a terrible situation. And I don't think there are many around this table or elsewhere who would be, you know, in favor of doing nothing about that. I think it's vital we provide a jobs guarantee, especially at a time when I don't think generally the need for work is declining. I mean, yes, automation will replace certain jobs or professions, perhaps, but it's certainly not, you know, creating a world of, you know, without work or workers. There'll be all sorts of new work that will also emerge. So I think a jobs guarantee is a much better way to tackle that particular part of the issue, which is those who want to work and simply cannot find proper employment. I agree, of course, with Jamie very much that there are plenty of jobs today that have no dignity, you know, totally inadequate pay and so on. I think the question is, does that therefore mean we shouldn't try and fix that, or, you know, or should we try and revalue those jobs as well? And yes, there are limits to that. I mean, if you are, you know, a cleaner in terrible conditions, it's never going to be, you know, a brilliant job. But I think you could also look at ways of making sure that someone doesn't have a single job. You know, there might be ways of sharing different duties so that you're not reduced to one thing all the time, right? So let's think broadly about this, and I think a jobs guarantee is part of the solution.
Thank you. Let's move on to the relationship with the other bits of the benefit system and the extent to which universal basic income can really replace the benefit system, or is it a sort of add-on? And we had a question in particular about PIP and DLA. So disability benefits, a particular case where benefits offer a special need and additional need. How does that relate to universal basic income? Mike, would you like to start?
Sure. Yes. I think it's thinking about that question that had led to my, sort of skepticism about a UBI, or at least I'm very skeptical that a UBI could replace the current benefit system. It is true that our benefit system is criticised for being complicated to understand and navigate your way through, but it is complicated by and large because people's lives are complicated, and because over time governments have devised different benefits to give different amounts of support or higher amounts of support to people who it thinks are in need of more support. And DLA and PIP is exactly one of those. So it's very, very, very difficult to imagine that a UBI could ever be so generous that it could actually mean that we wouldn't need any of these extra cost benefits to help people who are disabled or have health problems, or even to help people for paying their rent or have children. And so it is that thought process which then leads me to think, well, okay, if we see there's an issue with the benefit system and we need something else, then why don't we try and reform that first?
Yeah, Jamie?
Yeah, no, I think you're right about the complexity there. I think for me, something like disability support is about an individual support. So there's a fundamental difference between what we can provide to everybody as a universal basis, and then where there are specific needs for additional support on top of that. So I would very strongly believe that the disability would remain as an individual support, because each person's requirements there is very different. We can still provide a universal floor beneath that. I think the one that's, Mike's question about complexity, and I must admit, I first got involved in basic income discussions in 2016, and I didn't do so because I thought it was a policy we were going to introduce. I did it because I thought it was a good way to challenge and bring up some of the issues that we faced in the current context that we have now. Over those years, I've become much more convinced that it is a part of our answer to this. But I think the complexity is really difficult. And the one that we always find a really sticking point is around the housing market. Because how do you provide the support within a basic income for housing when the housing market across the UK is obviously so skewed in different places? Can't imagine a basic income where we can cover housing support for the southeast of England that wouldn't create a life of luxury in other parts of the country, or vice versa. So there's definitely complexities there that I think the discussions that everybody's brought up today around how do we look at the system and how do we start to change it is important. I suppose for me it comes back to what point is the current system savable, and at what point do we need a radical rethinking of it all? But I think it would be false, and I think it's not, from my experience, the majority of people who are trying to argue for a basic income are not approaching it from that utopian everything will magically be saved. I think the complexity is actually as part of what's driving that interest and commitment to it.
Good, thank you. We've only got a few more minutes, but I just want to raise the question. It's really about the future. It's about children. We've had a question in the questions about children of single parents. Over the years, we've failed miserably to prevent poverty amongst that group. We haven't had a good child maintenance system. We haven't had good support, but more generally, child poverty. We know this is on the increase. We know that it has long-term implications for children. What's basic income going to do in that respect? How is it going to help there? Adrian, you've got one, you can say one thing each on this because we need to finish off.
Well, I think when it comes to children, especially those with single parents, growing up in extraordinarily difficult circumstances, that, early years intervention, I think is going to make a much bigger difference to their life chances than necessarily universal basic income. So I would be in favor of, reintroducing where it's been scrapped and broadening the early years provision, because I think that's the key thing, the early learning, childcare, everything that they need in the first few years, because that will determine their life chances more than I think UBI could.
Thank you. Aida?
Yep. Yeah, I also would be in favor of the basic income for kids. I think the first years in life are dramatically important for the future of anyone. So making sure they have the good nutrition, the right means to go to school. The financial support is needed, and it's definitely something that we need to be in favor of.
Thank you. Jamie?
I think it's not an either or. I think we absolutely need the early years support, but I think financial insecurity is a huge blight and impact on people's lives, and we have to address that too. I co-authored a report last year on introducing a basic income for Scotland, and even at the quite low levels we proposed that were deliverable for Scotland, that would eliminate under the economic modelling destitution entirely under JRF categories. So I think it's an important aspect to build these two together, because the early years learning is a lot harder to impact if you're living in a life that's surrounded by insecurity and poverty.
Thank you. And Mike.
Thank you. I mean, of course, it's for children that we have something that's nearly like a basic income already. It's called child benefits, although it doesn't go to the better off families. It does go to over 80% of all families. So might be a good place to start if you're a UBI proponent. But then I would also say, well, why don't we just start by also lobbying against those that means test at the top and make it back into something that's universal in its own right.
Thank you very much. And just to add my own comment, I would increase child benefit substantially as a first step. We're hitting the end of our time. Apologies again for my failure at the beginning to make the system work, but the panel rose wonderfully above it and were completely confident and clear in what they were saying. We've had a very interesting discussion as part of a very interesting day. And I think the session now moves on to a pre-recorded session. So let me just say thanks again on behalf of all of you to the speakers who've been so interesting, and thanks to all of you for your chat and for your questions. And now I think short break and sessions. I'll pass you back to the people who know how it works. Thanks a lot, everyone.